It is written in the apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium by Pope Francis the following words: "An authentic faith, which is never comfortable or completely personal, always involves a desire to change the world, to transmit values, to leave this earth somehow better than we found it. We love this magnificent planet on which God has put us, and we love the human family which dwells here with all its tragedies and struggles, its hopes and aspirations, its strengths and weaknesses. The earth is our common home, and all of us are brothers and sisters. If indeed the just ordering of society and of the state is a central responsibility of politics, the Church cannot and must not remain on the sidelines in the fight for justice." Today we are honored to welcome a secular Franciscan, one of our own, Marie Dennis. Marie was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the United States. She is the mother of 6 children and the grandmother of 8 grandchildren. She has been a secular Franciscan for more than 20 years, and for perhaps that many years before that, she was involved with Franciscans. For 23 years, she worked for the Catholic an institute of religious priests and brothers in the United States called Marianol, and she also was for a number of years the director of the Office of Global Concerns, which involved issues of justice and peace. That is where I first met Marie when I was working at the Catholic Bishops' Conference. Prior to that, she and two friars and a religious sister created or formed the Assisi community, a small Catholic community founded in 1986 in the inner city of Washington, D.C., to be an inserted community, to live together, to support each other in the work for social transformation and peace. Members of the community have included women and men, ordained and lay, single and married, vowed religious, including Franciscans, OFM, and children of all ages. Marie also, in the last 2 years, is that correct? More. How many years? Well, excuse me, I stand corrected. For the last 7 years, Marie was appointed the co-president of Pax Christi International, a Catholic peace movement founded at the end of the Second World War to promote reconciliation between France and Germany, the French and Germans. Pax Christi now works on 5 continents and is composed of 115 member organizations. They're working to overcome open and systemic violence, something which has come up in our own discussions here. They're carrying this work forward through works of nonviolent civil action through civil societies in Syria and Iraq, peace education in the Philippines and in the United Kingdom, also working in different parts of the sub-Saharan Africa, and working for advocacy for an arms trade treaty to end the nuclear disarmament, to bring an end to nuclear armament. She's also a co-author of a book entitled St. Francis and the Foolishness of God, first written 20 years ago and revised. This book, I don't know if it's in other languages, in English, can be purchased in the bookshop of the Porziuncula. I think without any further delay, we have asked Marie to come to speak to us about what does it mean to be Franciscan and minor in the world today. What are the challenges and what are the opportunities for us? Marie, thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you all for the privilege of sharing some thoughts with you on this very important occasion. I'm honored as a woman and humbled as a secular Franciscan to be here with you. Please bear with the simplicity of my remarks today. What I will share will not be new to any of you. All that I can offer is the fruit of my own struggle to live with integrity as a Catholic Christian and a secular Franciscan, to live simply and in community in a U.S. culture that is driven by consumerism and individualism, to raise my children to act with justice and to live gospel values, and especially in my work for Maryknoll and for Pax Christi International, to use the remarkable insights of Francis and Clare to critique the powers and principalities, to transform the structures and systems of our times, and to contribute to a more just, peaceful, and sustainable world. As I read carefully through your thoughtful and challenging documents from recent years, including the lineamenta for this chapter, I was enormously impressed not only by the faithfulness of your efforts to follow Francis, which I, of course, expected, but also the depth with which you are reading the signs of the times in these early years of the 21st century. As a fraternity, like so many religious congregations, you are well practiced at reflecting on the reality of our world today in the light of the scriptures, the Francis Clariana tradition, and your own journey as friars minor, and at striving to shape your life in fraternity accordingly. Your attention in this general chapter to living a radically evangelical life of brotherhood and minority in the present time is a very good example. Even the very few days over the past years that I have spent here in Assisi, walking in the footsteps of Francis, Clare, and their companions, have given me an inkling of the physical rigors of the community's life in the early days. Although daily life for ordinary people in the first quarter of the 13th century was not easy, the first friars, and even more so Clare and her sisters, lived on the harsh margins of their society as a witness and an essential expression of discipleship in a context already dividing the rich and powerful from the poor and excluded. The brotherhood and minority that you seek, the witness you are called to give, is equally difficult and perhaps even more necessary in the 21st century than it was 800 years ago. Yet, specific insights of the Poverello have prepared the contemporary Francisclariana community very well for this challenge. Francis' understanding, for example, of social location on the margins and of creation-embracing community as characteristics of a Christian lifestyle continue to nurture and challenge, though the global context in which we are called to live out these values is fundamentally different. I deeply believe that the Order of Friars Minor has much to bring to our broken world, even more than you already have. As we reflect together on some of the most significant dimensions of the contemporary global context, I will be asking some questions of you from my perspective as a laywoman, a Franciscan, and an active member of the International Catholic Movement for Peace, Pax Christi. I hope that they will be helpful as you continue your reflections during this general chapter, which is such a significant event in the life of your order. Every day, as has been true since the beginning of the order, friars are witness to the devastation of poverty and violence, and in many places, to the heartbreak of war. The suffering of each individual person from hunger and insecurity, from homelessness and fear, was probably as severe in the 13th century as it is in the 21st century. But the deep root causes of the poverty we now encounter and the consequences of the wars, whether on a battlefield or on the street, are profoundly different. That contemporary poverty endures, when it could be eradicated, is deeply wrong. Does the minority of the order give witness to that fact? That fortunes are invested and made year after year preparing for war, when little is done to promote peace and inclusive security or resolve conflicts nonviolently, is scandalous. Does the Fraternity of Franciscans suggest another route, not only to personal sanctity or interpersonal understanding, both of which are important, but also to the need for public systems and structures, transnational policies and practices that promote sustainable peace and inclusive security? The challenges we face at this time in history are enormous, and they are no longer distinct, but are intertwined, interconnected at a root-deep level. So, for example, the economic injustices we care about, persistent poverty, the huge and growing gap between the very rich and the many impoverished, unjust trade agreements, illegitimate debt, and so on, are connected as cause and consequence to war and violent conflict. And both are connected, again, as cause and consequence, to environmental destruction and climate change. In the past few days, we have been hearing a great deal from El Salvador, thanks to the wonderful occasion of the beatification of Archbishop Oscar Romero. I was in El Salvador a few weeks ago and was struck by the many ways that poverty, violence, and environmental destruction interact and reinforce each other there. For example, gang violence is now rampant in poor neighborhoods in El Salvador. There, children who live in a barrio controlled by one gang are simply unable to go to school if their school happens to be in another barrio that is controlled by a rival gang. Obviously, their chances of moving out of poverty without a basic education are slim, even if there were good jobs available. Furthermore, many Salvadoran gangs were imported from the United States by young Salvadorans who fled from war and poverty in the 1980s, learned gang culture in the United States, and when deported by US authorities, brought the gangs back home. In El Salvador and in so many other contexts, no matter what is your point of entree, you will arrive at this knot of brokenness and dysfunction that has many expressions, but similar roots. Furthermore, The complex of issues we are dealing with at this point in history include existential threats, nuclear weapons, catastrophic levels of carbon emissions and climate change, threats to the very existence of the human community and the survival of Earth herself. Though these existential threats come almost entirely from the northern hemisphere, if not stopped, they will have an enormous impact on the entire planet. We all know that. In addition, thanks in large part to the rapid process of globalization that has taken place in recent decades, clashes between different ethnic, religious, and cultural groups over deeply held values and practices seem more frequent or more likely. One striking example is evident in the vastly differing roles and positions that women play in different contexts or societies. Another is apparent in the profoundly divergent worldviews between most indigenous cultures and industrialized, so-called developed societies. A third example might be the clash of values between the conservative Islamic world and the individualistic liberal West. I was in Beirut in the last few days, right before I came to Assisi, and I was stunned there by the visible illustrations of what might cause this clash of cultures. Beirut, as many of you know, has invested very heavily in the tourism industry. And although there are very, very few tourists in Beirut right now, still the contrast between the dress of heavily veiled Muslim women walking along the streets in Beirut and of tourists from other parts of the world was really startling. As I looked at that reality, I actually wondered why there isn't more tension than there already is. At the same time, even as we try to negotiate these challenges, amazing scientific discoveries at a super macro and super micro level are completely changing our understanding of the physical universe and of the human's place in that universe. Think of the Hubble's photos from outer space, of the 13.7 billion years since our universe began, of 170 billion galaxies in the observable universe. Think of genomes, of DNA, of nanoscience and nanotechnology. There are 25.4 million nanometers in an inch. It's almost beyond the reach of our imaginations, at least mine. These and so many other scientific discoveries through the exploration of outer space and of subatomic space are at least equal in magnitude to Eratosthenes' discovery that the Earth was round, or Einstein's realization that energy and matter are interchangeable, E equals mc squared. And they may, in fact, help us live more responsibly and as better neighbors to the rest of creation. We'll see. Some years ago, one of my sons, who was then a senior in high school, after yet another challenging conversation around the dinner table at Assisi Community, said, "I don't know whether to bless you or curse you, Mom. All my friends are dreaming about graduating from high school, going to college, getting a high-paying job and a big house, and living happily ever after with a family. You made me look at the reality of injustice in the world, and now I can't unknow that and go on with what I thought was a normal life. I laughed, but in reality, that is almost exactly what we are all facing now. We cannot unknow what we have begun to learn about the immensity of the universe, the fragility of the planet, the human's place as part of Earth community, the critical importance of diversity to our physical survival on this planet, as well as to healthier societies, the depth of relationality, the challenge of understanding and achieving sustainability. Cosmic consciousness has to affect who we are, how we live, everything we do. The ground has shifted. The context for our lives and for all of our work is different. What exactly that means will have to unfold as we live our way into the future. The interconnectedness of major global problems, including poverty, war, and ecological destruction, the challenging interface between vastly different social norms and practices, and this new cosmic consciousness do not paint the whole picture, but they will all be enormously important as we attempt to follow Francis and Claire, who are following Jesus, into a very challenging future. At the same time, I believe that the Francis Clariana tradition is better equipped than most to live and act with integrity in this complex world. Like Pope Francis, the saint's namesake 800 years later, St. Francis' worldview was built around relationships that honored the dignity of people living on the margins of 13th century Assisi, relationships of brotherhood, sisterhood with the rest of creation, reconciling and respectful relationships with the so-called enemy. Will the deliberations of your chapter move the order to a position of global leadership in addressing, through witness of lifestyle and ministry, the deep challenges that confront us now and will face us in the future? Allow me to explore in some depth three major signs of our times to which I believe the Fraternity of Friars Minor can give important witness. One is the intersection of economy and ecology. The second is the whole question of sustainable peace. The third is right relationships between men and women. We know that the now global economic system is marginalizing billions of people, bringing breathtaking, if empty, prosperity to a few, and simultaneously driving the wanton exploitation and destruction of natural systems, of species, and of the Earth's limited resources. This is not unfamiliar territory, but we are learning more and more clearly that all of the solutions to poverty that we seek must be sustainable in the deepest sense of that word, must contribute to the integrity of creation. The ethical insights of this insight, the ethical implications of this insight are, I believe, extremely important. The courage and creativity necessary to move in a truly sustainable, truly sustainable and just future are almost inconceivable. We have known for a long time, for example, that an unregulated, neoliberal, free market economy was a really bad idea. Those of us who were doing work in the 1970s and early 1980s in this area knew that it was going to hurt people who were already poor, and we watched that happen. Illegitimate debt and debt-driven structural adjustment programs, self-serving foreign aid programs, and unjust trade agreements, to which were added the financial shenanigans of global power brokers, have all contributed to this gap between a few who are extremely wealthy and the rest of us, especially the millions who are impoverished. Even the statistics that the world has used to measure levels of poverty in a given country don't work anymore because the distribution is so distorted and the move out of poverty so complex and difficult. Over the years, friars, with many others, have engaged fully in this arena of work and have had an impact. Not yet a big enough impact, but we all do know our way around these huge issues and have brought a serious moral debate into corporate boardrooms, to Wall Street, to the international financial institutions, and to national or multinational decision-making tables. You are simply unwilling to stand by while a system that is extremely powerful and now globalized makes a mockery out of social justice and the dignity of every human life. But what was new information just a few years ago, at least it was for me, is that the global economy, as it is now being driven by the pursuit of quantitative economic growth that depends on the expanded exploitation of natural resources, is completely unsustainable on planet Earth. While real economic growth is absolutely essential for impoverished communities where many of you live, it may well be an ethical abomination for already overdeveloped societies, and yet it is the holy grail of most economists. In the past 7 years, as, for example, the US and European economies have faltered, we have been told over and over again that economic growth is essential. Yet our economies, at least in the US and in much of Europe, are already consuming an unjust share of natural resources and contributing in significant ways to climate change and other environmental problems. We have to muster the creative imagination and the political will to transform the economic system that is supposed to support human life to one that respects the carrying capacity of Earth, resource limits, and natural processes. The bad news is that such a shift is extremely difficult to imagine. The good news is that given only one Earth, we don't have a choice. Our job is to invest financially and politically in a new economy that ensures social justice, honors the dignity of every person and all life, and is in harmony with the rhythms of the universe. Will the Order of Friars Minor, who have, I know, been responding with courage and transparency to your own extremely serious financial problems, help lead people of faith to understand the human and ecological consequences of deep injustice in the workings of the global economy and financial markets. The major economic and ecological challenge we are facing calls for a profound and urgent systemic transformation. And it has everything to do with who you are as Friars Minor, your commitment to poverty and community, to minority and fraternity, to a, quote, style of life that is significant, prophetic, evangelical, which by its very nature is a radical challenge and a gift to a world threatened by what Pope Francis calls an economy of exclusion and inequality. To nurture community, right, just relationships within local fraternities, within the order, at a societal level, and with the whole Earth community, and to seek a simpler life based on sufficiency are essential to followers of Francis and Jesus, and will hopefully promote in the world lifestyles that may in fact be sustainable. The way of life to which you aspire is not only a discipline for the sake of personal virtue, it also models a direction in which the entire human community is called to move, a direction in stark contrast to the radical individualism projected by the globalization of a free market neoliberalism that is threatening unique cultures, exacerbating the gap between a few who are excessively rich and a vast majority who are poor and rapidly consuming or destroying the planet. In the coming weeks, Pope Francis will promulgate his eagerly anticipated encyclical on ecology. Shortly after his election, in explaining his choice of Francis as his name, he emphasized that Francis of Assisi is the man of poverty, the man of peace, the man who loves and protects creation. And he added, "These days, we do not have a very good relationship with creation, do we? Will this chapter be remembered as one which called the Order of Friars Minor to a deeper, more demanding, more visible witness among the brothers living in fraternity to the desperate need for right economic relationships between humans and with the rest of creation?" Life in community is not easy. Every day is a challenge, at least it has been for me in these 30 years that I've been living at Assisi Community. Everything about our community is imperfect. But it has been, for me, a phenomenal way to taste the joy of the gospel in the context of a hungry world and a threatened planet. I am convinced that your experience of fraternity is a treasure that needs to be carefully tended and very widely shared. Another interconnected example of the reality we are facing in our world has to do with peace and security. Several years ago, as we tried to understand the significance of the new cosmology, the new universe story, for our work at the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns, we described one main area of our focus as sustainable pathways to peace and inclusive human security. But we had a very hard time figuring out quite what that meant. I am still finding it challenging to define sustainable peace holistically, even though it's what I think about all the time for Pax Christi. A few things are clear. One is what I said earlier. Violent conflict and war are of a piece with poverty and economic injustice, as with ecological destruction. There is no such thing as a sustainable future, or any future, unless we radically shift our understanding of security and move on to an entirely different stage, if you will, that creates space for carefully negotiating the turbulent water where different cultural values and customs, religious beliefs, and ideologies encounter each other. That is not a new thought to any of you, but it is a challenge that is at least as huge as the economic and ecological challenge I was just describing, and it is equally urgent. Some of you and many friars come from regions of the world that are exhausted by violence, war, and religious persecution. Others come from countries and cultures that have repeatedly perpetrated violence and war, either openly or by scandalous levels of investments in preparations for war or through aggressive marketing of weapons. That breadth of life experience and your charism as bearers of peace, may the Lord give you peace, invest in the order, I believe, a significant responsibility to engage in the hard work of peacemaking. Recent scholarship has begun to make much more visible that extraordinary chapter in the order's history that speaks so directly to this facet of your mission in our dangerous contemporary reality. The encounter between Malik al-Kamil, Sultan of Egypt, and Francis in the middle of the Fifth Crusade speaks clearly to the possibilities presented by active nonviolence, even in situations as difficult today as those in Syria or Nigeria, Iraq, or Israel-Palestine. A few years ago, I visited a small village in the Shamali Valley outside of Kabul in Afghanistan, a few tents and a few small houses populated by families trying to reclaim life after years living as refugees in Pakistan. The narrow pathway to one of the small houses was lined with stones painted half red and half white. The white half of the stones marked the pathway, faced the pathway, and indicated that that pathway was cleared of landmines. The red half of the stones pointed out to the rest of the yard around the house, indicating that there could well be landmines buried there. How a family with children and animals can survive in such a situation is beyond me. They, like their neighbors, were trying to eke out an existence in a geography riddled with landmines and unexploded ordnance. Step by step, literally, they were clearing the land. Work toward the new creation, work for peace is like that, slowly pushing back the fear, the terrible threat of violence, the reality of social injustice to make room for life. For much too long, particularly in the global north, we have been living in and subjecting the world to a paradigm that justifies enormous loss of human life and widespread destruction of the planet in pursuit of an elusive peace, of false security, and a guaranteed high standard of living, at least for some. The consequences of this framework have been front and center in the lives of millions of people around the world, including many friars. Hundreds of thousands in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, now Syria, Libya, and elsewhere have been killed or maimed. Millions have been displaced, and international human rights laws have been undercut with impunity. Effective peacemaking acknowledges the interdependence of communities around the world. The fact that wherever we're from, wherever we're from, our security is intrinsically interconnected with that of the families in that little village in Afghanistan is crucial. You know that well. In the soil surrounding the village are planted the landmines of further violence and the seeds of peace. But to understand that fact and to discern how we might nurture the signs of peace and snuff out the roots of violence, we have to get close enough to such marginal places from where the world looks entirely different to understand. That is exactly what Francis did and what you do by your minority. Friars living in the inner city of the United States, for example, don't have to guess about the root causes of the anger that is so deep among young African American youth and that is erupting more and more often in the streets, sometimes violently. These friars know about the persistent racism, about racial profiling, about police brutality, about unemployment and inferior education. Can they help break open the roots of a growing conflict in the United States before it gets worse? The friars' perspective elsewhere must be similar in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in the Holy Land, in Kenya, in El Salvador, in Mexico, and on and on. Your Franciscan greeting, "The Lord grant you peace," and your vantage point as you accompany marginalized people speak to your way of being present in the world as brothers to all, even the enemy. 7 years ago, in Pilgrims and Strangers and the World, you wrote, "The brothers announced and encouraged peace. By doing good, they opposed the evils of war, the many forms of exploitation and ostracism, destruction and oppression, wherever they encountered it. In today's world, racked by wars and terrorism, by widespread social injustice and hunger, we Friars Minor should speak up for peace," you said, "in a way that demands action." We all know that fear has been globalized. Every day, we are reminded that violent extremism, often but not always under the guise of religion, is spreading. Gang violence, organized crime, and militarized security forces hold many communities hostage. As I said before, war and preparations for war are big business, literally. World military expenditures in real terms in 2014 were $1.8 trillion US dollars. A very dangerous arms race is underway in Asia, and the Middle East is awash in weapons that continue to fuel a treacherous situation. The same is true in Africa and in many other parts of the world. In this world, where 147 Kenyan university students were slaughtered by al-Shabaab militants, where 11 million Syrians have been displaced by vicious fighting, where life itself is threatened by nuclear weapons, how do friars say, "The Lord grant you peace"? As followers of Francis, you are uniquely prepared to promote peace, a peace that preempts every inclination to violence and war, a new paradigm rooted in an unwavering commitment to the value of every life, even, once again, to the life of my bitterest enemy. It takes my breath away to say that the life of the most brutal member of ISIS or Al-Shabaab or Boko Haram is as precious in the eyes of God as is the life of my 2-year-old granddaughter, Natalie Rose. But that is what we believe, and hopefully what we practice. In the last century, Catholic teaching on war and peace has shifted in significant ways. Renewed attention has been given to the practice of nonviolence, not only as a personal option, but as a tool for public authorities as well. 22 years ago, the Catholic bishops of the United States said Christian nonviolence consists of a commitment to resist manifest injustice and public evil with means other than force. National leaders, they said, bear a moral obligation to see that nonviolent alternatives are seriously considered for dealing with conflicts. Nonviolent strategies need greater attention in international affairs, and yet that has not happened. St. Francis' belief in the importance of right relationships among the brothers and sisters who followed him made nonviolence the operative principle in the Franciscan fraternity. His repeated efforts to mediate conflict within the larger community of Assisi and neighboring villages demonstrated that his commitment was to active nonviolence. His resistance to the Crusades and his journey to visit the Sultan gave witness to his belief in the possibility of nonviolence and respect as basic to the relationships between different cultures and religions. His understanding of the brotherhood, sisterhood between humans and the rest of creation reinforced his commitment to nonviolence in those relationships. His intense desire to share in the sufferings of Christ led him to the heart of Jesus' witness to the power of active nonviolence that takes on violence, even death, rather than inflicting violence on another person. Your general constitutions of 1987 say, in protecting the rights of the oppressed, the friars are to renounce violent action and have recourse to means that are otherwise available even to the powerless. And conscious also of the terrible dangers that threaten the human race, the friars are to denounce in the strongest terms every kind of warlike action and the arms race as a very serious calamity for the world and a very great injury to the poor. They are to spare neither work nor sacrifice to build up God's kingdom of peace. I urge you to follow Francis' lead, to contribute in positive ways to the development of Catholic teaching on nonviolence and to the practice of active nonviolence. We who oppose war, who yearn for peace, need to engage energetically in the development of more and more effective nonviolent practices for protecting nonviolent vulnerable communities, avoiding violent conflict, and promoting cultures of peace. For the translators, I'm going to skip a paragraph or two here and there in the interests of time. Are there among the friars minor some who are walking in Francis' footsteps toward Malik al-Kamil? Will you emerge from this general chapter with a burning desire for the Order of Friars Minor to bring its charism of peace prophetically to a world in danger of dissolution? In your preparatory documents for this chapter, you wrote, "Our name speaks of an eminently relational identity. We are brothers, and we are minors. If brotherhood specifies the type of relationship that we are called to establish with all, minority defines the place from which to establish this relationship as an attitude and spirituality that leaves space for the existence of the other. Your commitment to brotherhood, to living the gospel radically and sincerely in community, is an urgently needed witness to a world threatened by individualism and greed. As Friars Minor, you are called to relationship that recognizes and affirms otherness in all its dimensions, and therefore can be the basis of shalom, of sustainable peace and persistent nonviolence. But the attitude and spirituality you describe suggest another crucial role for Friars Minor in our world and perhaps especially in our church. On International Women's Day, March 8th this year, I participated in an extraordinary event inside the Vatican. Called Voices of Faith, it was a rather small gathering in the Casina Pio IV, during which Catholic women from around the world shared their stories and tried to express as honestly as they could what it feels like to be a woman in the Catholic Church. The exchange was neither shrill nor accusatory, but it was deeply honest. As a leader in Pax Christi, an international Catholic peace movement, I anticipate eagerly each year the Holy Father's words on the Holy Father's Day of Peace message. This year's message, no longer slaves but brothers and sisters, was beautiful, and I noticed right away the effort by Francis or the English translators to be inclusive in the use of language. Brothers and sisters, people of goodwill, humanity. But ultimately, the document focused on the importance of fraternity, which in English refers to a community of brothers. For the Order of Friars Minor, the word fraternity carries deep meaning and is perfectly accurate. But when the intention, as in other contexts, is to also refer to women, we need to find a more inclusive term. This is a delicate area that evokes the challenging interface between vastly different societal norms and practices that I mentioned earlier. Women's experiences and expectations differ significantly from one culture to the other. That is why listening to women ourselves, what we have to say, is so important. Women in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, women in Iraq or Syria, women in Asia, women in traditional and indigenous societies, women in the West, young women, older women. We all have stories that must be heard. In our church, I believe that the friars could listen very well. I know that many of you do already, and you've demonstrated that by inviting a woman to your general chapter. But I encourage you to keep up the practice. That example of right relationships from the founders of the Franciscan order offers a powerful example to our contemporary church and to the world. Will you, during this chapter, give renewed emphasis to your foundational Francis Clariana value of equal partnership with women in the task of building the new creation? Pope Francis' arrival on the scene and his refreshing manner of gently repairing some of the painful tears in our church is filling many of us with hope, which leads me to the last word I want to speak this afternoon, and that is about hope itself. The Francis Clariano way is, I believe, fundamentally hopeful. People often ask me how I can bear moving from one war zone to the other, and isn't it enormously depressing? And my experience, like yours, I suspect, is exactly the opposite. The Order of Friars Minor is better equipped than most to help with the demining task that was being done in that little village in the Shamali Valley in Afghanistan, that task of clearing the way for a more just, fruitful, and peaceful world. You bring deep experience with marginalized people. You, in Pope Francis' words, smell like the sheep. Around the world, friars, by vocation and commitment, have long-term, deep relationships with people living on the margins and affected by injustice and violence. You are also part of an amazing global network. If, as many say, our most precious asset is the web of relationships we have, you are blessed beyond measure. From what I can see, the Order of Friars Minor has remarkable reach on this planet. For you to live with faithfulness, the fraternity and minority to which you aspire could have tremendous impact for good in our world. During this general chapter, will you commit Friars Minor to fully engage in the difficult work of the gospel for which your founder prepared the order so well? In other words, will you make this general chapter a new beginning for the Order of Friars Minor? Let us begin, brothers, Francis said, to serve the Lord God, for until now we have done little or nothing. Not to do so would be a monumental tragedy for the order, for the church, and for the world. To do so will go far to bring about the new creation, the new heavens and the new earth described so beautifully in Isaiah 65 and Revelations 21, and for which we all so ardently yearn. Thank you. No. That's good.